Chapter 19. True Alpha vs. False King. The skies erupted with a blue light as the burst stream struck Ghidorah's chest, causing him to fly backward for over 100 meters before graciously falling to the ground in a heap. Madison couldn't believe her eyes, but it was the ground beneath her, trembling every so often with a deep thunderous sound accompanying each tremor, which caught her breath and attention. Slowly turning around, she heard that roar, which could only come from him. As she fully turned around, she beheld the mighty Godzilla stomping forward through knee-deep water, caused by the floods from Ghidorah's storm. His eyes and spine flashed and pulsed with every other step. His broad shoulders swayed gently from side to side as he walked, but the impressive musculature, coupled with the massive legs and neck, were intimidating to look at. Still, Madison couldn't help but smile as he raised his head towards the fighter jet-filled sky and unleashed a roar. As if on cue, the fighter jet racing overhead began arcing out and around, taking aims at the three-headed false king who Godzilla glared down as it began to rise up and spread its wings as it did in Antarctica. The snarl on Godzilla's face says it all. "Oh, big guy's pissed," Rick said excitedly. "He's definitely ready to kill something," Eileen said quietly. "We zeroed in on the last ping on the Orca. Fenway Park, dead ahead," Sam announced. "Will, lay down cover fire to keep Ghidorah distracted," a pilot said over comms. "Colonel, all squadrons are locked on target," another soldier relayed. "Anata, ga, shin o, Gojira, diro, koto, o, shomai. Prove you are the true king, Gojira," Sirizara proclaimed forcefully. With the Argo leading the charge, all the squadrons opened fire on Ghidorah, who crossed his wings in front of him to protect his body from the blast. Dozens of missiles impacted the target, some of them sneaking overhead and around the wing from various angles to strike the head retreating behind them. Ghidorah roared in anger, but even with three heads, they couldn't find a singular target to focus on. That was, of course, until Godzilla roared at the top of his lungs, sending a concussive burst through the air which struck Ghidorah's body and drew his attention. "Did you see that? The force of his roar alone created a shockwave," Sam proclaimed. "Damn right, brothers. That kid Martin setting off the nuke has that lizard juiced," Rick replied. The two monsters snarled at one another, and Godzilla began a charge of his own. With speed belaying his size, Godzilla sprinted towards his foe as Ghidorah also began a sprint, using its wing as forelimbs to stabilize itself as it ran. And at last, the two behemoths collided, sending a massive shockwave through the air, which, when it struck the planes and the Argo, momentarily stuttered their electronic systems. "Holy shit! Is it me, or has it been working out?" Sam asked. "Gojira feeds on the radiation and uses it as a source of power. Setting off the nuke has made him more powerful than before," Serizawa said. "Oh, well, that's definitely good, right?" Sam asked. "Not necessarily," Rick called, sliding his chair across to his station. "Oh no," he muttered. "What is that?" Eileen asked. "Godzilla's radiation level has gone through the roof. So, we've got about 12 minutes before he goes thermonuclear," Rick called. "What does that mean?" Foster asked. "In about 12 minutes, it's gonna suck to be a Red Sox fans," Rick replied. Foster shook her head and rolled her eyes while balling her fists and pumping them down. In her mind, his face was there. "Okay, guys, you need to find the organ, get Madison, and get the hell out of there," Sam called over the radio. Mark and several soldiers were on a chopper headed for Fenway Park listening in. That new trick worked a little too well on Godzilla. It's going to explode like a nuke himself in less than 12 minutes. Sam finished. Roger that. Prepare for landing, Barnes called back. Right in front of the chopper, Godzilla gripped hard to Ghidorah's neck and threw him several hundred meters off to the sides and through a skyscraper, descending as fast as they could with Godzilla's hulking form lumbering in the background. Mark and the other prepared to disembark and begin the search. One soldier crossed himself. Barnes took a deep breath, and the others all gripped their weapons a little more tightly. Godzilla unleashed a roar as a stray lightning strike hit the chopper, causing it to momentarily lose balance. Inside, the crew struggled to maintain the footing, but the chopper and her crew managed to hold it as she finally touched down and opened the rear door. The first two soldiers out were instantly vaporized by a stray lightning flare from Ghidorah's attack, which had slammed into Godzilla's chest, knocking him back several steps in the background. Go, 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 Barnes ordered. Mark exited the chopper and ran to an open space to get a good look at his surroundings. But the first thing he saw was the titanic form of Ghidorah looming overhead over him. Each step's rattling rattled the ground as he walked forward towards Godzilla. His head lashed out to bite at him, but Godzilla spun around, and his gargantuan tail sailed through the air at blistering speed, creating a sonic boom as it passed overhead before impacting Ghidorah's hip, sending him sprawling to the ground with a shriek of pain. Medicine! Mark screamed. I got something! Over here! A soldier cried out. Mark sprinted over as another lightning blast shook the ground, causing Mark to fall onto a hunk of debris. You alright? The soldier called. Yeah, yeah, Mark replied. I found the archer, sir. It's pretty banged up, he continued. No sign of your daughter. Suddenly, almost directly above them, Ghidorah and Godzilla clashed once more. Swatting one of their heads to the side, Godzilla grabbed the other two and pushed Ghidorah away, arcing his hand back to take a swing. Godzilla was stopped cold by Ghidorah's free head biting down his neck and shoulder, all in turn. Chomp, chomp, chomp. We gotta get out of here. Let's go, the soldier yelled. But as they fled towards the chopper, Ghidorah's massive foot flew down and crushed it like it was nothing. Some explosion erupted where the chopper once stood, and the shrapnel flew out, striking several of the soldiers. Some of the strikes were fatal, others not. But for those whom it wasn't fatal, it was arguably worse than they had to endure such pain. Godzilla, meanwhile, was lifted up by his neck and slammed with tremendous force into the ground and dragged about 50 meters by Ghidorah. But Godzilla would not be beaten so easily. The whirring and pulsing of his signature attack began to fill the air. Ghidorah's outer head fought desperately to stop him while the center head held his throat, but Godzilla's powerful claws dug into the side of the central neck and pulled it away, giving him enough space to launch his thermonuclear breath straight into Ghidorah's chest. The blast immediately lifted Ghidorah off the ground and sent him back several hundred meters. Ghidorah was able to stabilize itself and withstand the blows, but not without a massive, sizzling, steaming burn mark being left behind, darkening his once gleaming golden scale. Suddenly, above Ghidorah, the skies began to sparkle, as all sound began to vanish from the minds of the marks in the soldiers. The heart began to calm, and a warm feeling surged through them, eliminating their previously panicked state. On the Argo, Eileen's closed eye fluttered open as a smile crept onto her face. Flashing a rainbow of colors, the clouds suddenly burst open, giving the way to the arrival of Mothra as she struck Ghidorah's free head with a silk like attack, sticking them to a skyscraper right next to him. The white head managed to break free and watch her as she sailed around to gain distance, and it tried to bite the webbing to free its sibling. However, in the reflection of the glass came a familiar and not very welcome face, accompanied by a pulsing blue light. The head turned just in time to see Godzilla arrive as he body slammed Ghidorah, sending both of them through the building and Ghidorah to the ground of his feet. Huffing through his nose, Godzilla glared down his foes as Mothra begins a rapid descent with her spike-like legs primed and ready to dig into Ghidorah's flesh. But an orange-red light beside her permeated the clouds before the massive form of Rodent suddenly crashed through them, catching Mothra completely off guard. With a shriek of aggression, Rodent's talons swept up Mothra, pushing her off course and attempting to dig into her abdomen. Thinking quickly, she managed to slam her legs down and push his claw feet away. Both flapped their enormous wing in a display of intimidation and aggression before diving at one another and sailing through the skies and breakneck speeds. Mark and the others stood sheltered beneath a already fallen section of a building as Rodan and Mothra raced overhead. The beats of their wings create hurricane force beneath them, which swept a lot of the debris away. Luckily for Mark and the others, the debris they hid under was heavy enough to resist, although it did slide across the ground a few times, forcing them to move with it or be swept away. Ghidorah, meanwhile, having managed to right itself, had charged his beam attack and unleashed it at full force towards Godzilla, but the blasts were intercepted mid-flight by his thermonuclear breath, and supercharged as he was, his breath slowly managed to push the beam back until Ghidorah had to break the attack and try to dodge as he had in Antarctica. But the blast was too large, and it still managed just to singe the scales and flesh near the base of the neck, causing Ghidorah to scream out in pain and snarl menacingly at Godzilla, who was now rapidly closing in once again. It just wouldn't stop. The mayhem above around them kept Mark and the others pinned down and unable to move. Every time they tried, Mothra and Rodan would swoop by in the aerial battle with their acrobatics, knocking over buildings and sending debris and wind force flying their way. That or Godzilla and Ghidorah would clash too close for comfort. Finally, breaking through the fire nearby, a military jeep screeched to a halt with Emma at the wheel. "Get in!" she yelled. A fighter jet trying to help Mothra was struck accidentally by a wing, sending it flying into the ground far close to the group to be safe. Everyone hit the deck, and after it skidded by them, barely misses the jeep. Emma screamed for them again to get in, loading the injured as fast and safely as they could. They all scattered in the back as Mark took the seat up front. The jeep streaked down the road at top speed with the sounds of battle raging around them. "Where's Madison?" Mark demanded. "I told her to run home as fast as she could after activating the Orca at the stadium," she called back over the roaring of the monsters. Rain and thunderous claps of sonic booms from Mothra and Rodent's wing beats and screeching aerial speed. Another explosion to the left forced the jeep momentarily off course, where it jumped from a pile of rubble and landed unsteadily back on its all four wheel. "We got the Orca back. It's pretty messed up," Mark called. "Is it in one piece?" she asked. "Yeah? Good. Then I can fix it later. We need to get to Maddie." "That's the first sensible thing you've said in a long time, Maddie. In the long time, Emma." Another explosion, this time to the right. "Don't you even get started with me, Mark. I tried to talk sense into you far too many times. in our relationships for you to ever lecture me on the subject, she yelled back. I will lecture you on your recent actions as much as I want. You sided with a psychopath, and you didn't even try to understand where I was coming from. You only saw who I was working with. I heard you, what you said, just fine, thanks. You heard it and you didn't care to understand it. Godzilla's tail suddenly landed in front of the Jeep, forcing Emma to slam on the brakes. The Jeep screeched to a halt, just shy of hitting it as it was lifted and swept both of them out. Godzilla tried for another tail whip against Ghidorah, who nimbly evaded it and grabbed his arms with two heads and lifted with with two heads, while the third blasted Godzilla's face point blank with his lightning attack. Go, go! Barnes shouted at Emma. Emma smashed the gas, sending the jeep lurching forward. Damn it, Mark. Can we please talk about this later? Emma yelled. Fine. My thoughts exactly, Mark yelled back. Rodan and Mothra screeched in the skies above as Rodan was shoved face first into a building, with Mothra's leg pushing against his back between his wings. Mothra shoved further, and Rodan's talon dug into the side of the building as he pushed against her and freed himself. But Mothra blasted the back of his head with silk, pinning his head to the building just like Ghidorah before. And with Rodan temporarily pinned, she leaped away from him and flew towards Godzilla and Ghidorah. Swimming by beneath Rodan, the entire group suddenly began sweating. Is it getting hot in here? Or is it just me? Barnes asked. No, something's definitely happening out there, Emma shouted as the jeep continued racing by. Above them, the building was melting. Literally melting. Rodan's entire body was glowing red-orange like the fiery embers at the base of his wings. A single screech could be heard echoing through the air as steam and shimmering heat waves rose from his bodies. The webbing around his head burst into flames. In a second, he ripped his head free of the tangled mess and shoved off from the building, sending the entire structure falling to the ground, where the top half began flattering out into a pool of molten metal, stone, glass, and burning wood. Rodan raced through the skies after Mothra at top speed, breaking the sound barrier with a thundering sonic boom. Mothra heard it, but turned too late to stop his claws from raking by her as she brought her leg up to protect herself. Her left foreleg was torn at the joint, causing her to shriek in agony as green yellow blood spurted forth from the now missing limb. Rodents raced out and arched around his turn, creating another boom as the rain rapidly evaporated, creating a shroud of steam around his body, making him harder to see despite the glowing orange-red aura he was producing. Mothra dove down at the last second, but the tip of her wings was clipped by his claw, sending it floating down to the ground. Despite this, Mothra regained her flight path and landed on top of a building to observe him as he raced around towards her. The steam was beginning to vanish as the aura receded, but he wasn't slowing down. If anything, he sped up even more. He flapped his wing, propelling himself forwards towards her. But the boom was delayed almost an entire second after the flap before it thunderously echoed through the cityscape. What the hell? Barnes asked. Don't worry about it. We're almost there, Mark shouted as Emma raced the jeep through the still war-torn streets. Chapter 20 Ragnarok. An explosive, concussive burst of wind erupted from behind a skyscraper, instantly leveling the structure and tearing the roofs of hundreds of dwellings and small businesses within the blast radius. The impact came as Rodden's claw dug into the earth, having narrowly missed his target, who was still airborne and gauging distance above him. Morpha screeched and dove down on top of him, with all five of her spike legs slamming down into Rodden's back as he fought himself to free himself from the ground. The, the force dove him onto his stomach, and the spike-like ends piercing his flesh, causing a small spurt of blood to emerge, followed by a shriek of pain. Mothra pulled her legs free and raised her right foreleg up high into the air and began to thrust it down as hard as she could. But Rodan twisted something beneath her by folding his left wing down and rolling onto his backside, throwing Mothra off balance and tumbling to the ground next to him. Using his right wing, he pushed her down flat and pinned her to the ground, while continuing to continuing to roll until he was now on top of her. One of his claw dug into the base of her abdomen, while the other stabilized him above her. Mothra cried in agony as his claw dug deeper and deeper with a horrible crunch before she managed to stab him in the stomach with one of her legs. Rodan hunched forward from the impact and backed off, giving her space to spin and get to her feet and take to the air. As she did so, her flight path was shaky. She landed on a building and caught her breath, releasing a weakened cry for help as she slumped onto her belly, with, with her legs hanging over the edge. Rodan, sensing her distress, took to the skies and rose higher and higher into the air before beginning a dive bomb, with talons extended ready to slam into her head and back, tearing them apart. Mothra released another loud cry for help as Rodan grew closer and closer. Suddenly, a blue burst stream shattered a skyscraper next to one Mothra perched on and slammed into Rodan, stopping him dead in his tracks and sending him hurtling through the air and crashing to the ground on the opposite end of the neighborhood. Godzilla's roar shook the ground, followed by a swift cry of pain from the king of the monsters as Ghidorah seized the opportunity to strike while he was distracted with helping Mothra. But Godzilla's blast did much more than just help her. Rodan, despite being biovolcanic, wasn't prepared for the impact force of the breath weapon and struggled to breathe properly. Mothra, on the other hand, now had time to rest and recuperate, while Godzilla continued his battle with the false king. Speaking of, the Titanic alien leaped high into the air and slammed both feet into Godzilla's chest, knocking him back onto his back, with four large gashes appearing in his flesh from the impact. Godzilla shrieked in agony as blood poured from all four wounds, and as Ghidorah landed behind him, he lifted both tails, extended the spike-like extension each, and slammed them down into Godzilla's gut. The spike pierced his hide, pushing it in further than it was used to going, which resulted in Godzilla gasping and coughing a massive spurt of saliva and blood from his mouth. The tails were lifted and slammed down again and again with similar results until Godzilla looked up and back and fired his thermonuclear breath into Ghidorah's back, knocking him forward and onto his stomach. Godzilla rolled to his side and pushed himself up to his feet with a long and agonized groan. The four gashes on his chest ran deep, one of them deep enough that a tiny silver of bone from his ribcage could be visible. Blood poured slowly from the wound down his stomach and legs to the ground below. Had anyone been around to collect it, they'd be able to fill several Olympic-sized swimming pools just with this recent drip. Ghidorah struggled to push itself up, lacking true forelimbs outside of its massive wings. Getting up was a clumsy affair. Godzilla, not wasting any time, stomped towards his opponent, towards his foe, grabbed both tail and began pulling on them as hard as he could. Ghidorah's outer two heads turned 180 degrees and fired the lightning blast into his now gashed chest. Godzilla shrieked in agony but refused to let go of his enemy. Clenching his jaw tightly, Godzilla snarled and against the pain and leaned forward slightly. The two heads stopped their attack as the third came up and its eyes widened. Godzilla lurched back, and with a large, sharp turn at the waist, and Ghidorah suddenly was launched backwards as Godzilla threw the massive titan by the tail over his shoulder. Up high into the air, he swung before his massive form struck the ground with a nuclear force. The ground shook for miles as a small crater from the impact force materialized beneath him. Ghidorah's free head all coughed and gagged, now fighting for breath after that devastating blow. Godzilla, meanwhile, backed away a few steps and leaned forward to catch his own breath. But the hit just won't stop coming. Suddenly, Godzilla felt a massive impact against the back of his head, which caught him completely off guard. Godzilla Rodan had flown above and past his head, flying slow enough to scrape his armored belly against the king's skull, knocking him to the ground with a cry of agony and shock. Rodan flapped his wing, creating a thunderclap, and his body produced another sonic boom as he broke the sound barrier and flew a straight line away before pulling a tight high G turn and turning and diving back down towards Godzilla. The Alpha looked up towards Rodan with a snout, his spine flashing an intimidation display as he made it to his feet. Godzilla roared with fury at Rodan, his roar creating a mini shockwave which struck Rodan's body and causing him to hesitate. Rodan flapped his wings to stop himself, hovering in the air and looking down at Godzilla. The king of the monsters continued flashing his spine and snarling at Rodan, stomping his right foot every so often and growling as Rodan chirped back at him. "What's going on out there?" Rick asked. "Dunno, but if I have to guess, I'd say Godzilla's communicating with him," Sam replied. "Of course, Rodan's responding to Godzilla's alpha status," Dr. Graham stated. "But can he convince Rodan to switch sides?" Eileen asked. "I guess we'll find out. And by the way, we got 8 minutes until he blows," Rick added. Rodan continued hovering and chirping at Rodan as the wounded king growled and stomped while flashing his spines. Meanwhile, from within his crater, Ghidorah rose slowly, keeping a low profile as he began sneaking up behind Godzilla. Godzilla chirped louder and snarled, and Godzilla's eyes flashed as the sound of his nuclear breath charging for real began to pulse through the air. Rodan flapped his wing again to gain some distance, but before Godzilla could unleash the blast, Ghidorah's center head suddenly lurched forward and wrapped around his neck. The outer head bit down hard on both of his wrists to hold them in place so that he couldn't scratch his way out of it. Godzilla's spine was a bit of a hindrance, and Ghidorah had to adjust his position slightly behind and to the side to avoid being struck by them. But once he found his footing, he managed to slowly push Godzilla down to the ground while slowly choking the life out of him as Rodan floated in the air, watching silently. "Oh shit!" Rick exclaimed. "All squadrons! Anyone have ammos left?" Foster asked. "Negative. We're all out," the pilot responded. "Damn it, we're all out too," Foster growled. "There must be something we can do," We have to help Gojira, Sarah said frantically. Wait, Eileen said. The others looked to her as her eye fluttered shut. She's on her way, she whispered. Rodan noticed her too late, and Martha burst through the clouds at top speed, jamming her enormous stinger into Ghidorah's back at full force. The impact caved into the musculature between his wings, and a massive spurt of brown-red blood erupted from the wound as all three of Ghidorah's heads opened their mouths to shriek in pain and release Godzilla. Godzilla Mothra pushed the stinger in as deep as she could, and her abdomen began to pulse as she released a potent venom into his body. Rodan began to dive to help Ghidorah, but Mothra's quick thinking allowed her to pull free and leap away, causing Rodan to slam into Ghidorah instead as she gained distance and circled around for another pass. Ghidorah's left head bit Rodan's neck and threw him off of himself as Mothra came around, slamming the side of her front leg into Ghidorah's center head and causing it to whiplash into the ground. Thrown for a loop, the center head's eye rolled and fluttered for a moment before closing, out cold. The other two had roared in anger as Ghidorah stood up and spread its wing, but it couldn't do so fully. The musculature between the wings was still damaged, and it could only open them to around shoulder level before the pain became unbearable, as well as Mothra's venom was having an effect as well, and causing the flesh and scales to begin degrading and decaying. What's going on? Sam asked. It's hemotoxin, Dr. Graham replied. Hemotoxins affects both blood and soft tissues like the skin and muscles, she continued. Cool. I didn't know she could do that, Rick cheered. Ghidorah's two-head growled as the third hung limp and unconscious in front of the body. The other two began charging their attack as Rodan made it to his feet and hobbled out of the way. But before the blast could be released, Ghidorah was struck in the side by Godzilla's thermonuclear breath, and he toppled over into a building, while Rodan took to the skies. Godzilla's breathing was labored and strained, the pain in his chest from the gashes, and his fatigue setting in were both taking their toll as he used a building to support himself as he stood. Martha landed next to him, chirping at him as he looked down at her. A few chirps later, Martha took to the air and gave chase against Rodan to keep him distracted while Godzilla snarled and marched towards Ghidorah. Damn, those guys are tough, Rick said. No kidding. Those gashes have to be burning right now, Sam added. Martha's wounds are significant as well. She's struggling to stay airborne, Eileen observed. Sure enough, Martha was struggling to stay with Rodan as he continued to increase his speed and left her in the dust. The damaged leg, damaged abdomen, and the missing wingtips were begging to take a toll on her, just as Godzilla's wounds were taking on him. Martha was forced to give up the chase and circled down to land on a building to wait. But when she looked up, Rodan was gone. Martha remained as still as possible, waiting for Rodan to reveal himself. She could hear his screeches, but the skyscraper around her made it hard to pinpoint where they were coming from. Finally, the clouds broke as Rodan dove down at Rodan at full speed, breaking the sound barrier. But as the world went silent as he raced ahead of the sound he created, a blinding flash of light enveloped his vision and momentarily blinded him. Shutting his eyes and screeching in pain, Rodan suddenly turned and slammed into a building and crashed into the ground, skidding alongside the cityscape for hundreds of meters before coming to a halt. Rodan's eyes opened slightly before shut again immediately as his sensitivity to light had dramatically increased since the flash Martha's body slowly lost the glow as she looked at Rodan and shook her head with, with a satisfied chirp. But a chirp, but a roar from Godzilla drew her attention the other way. Godzilla's throat was locked in a vice grip from one head as the other bit down onto his shoulder. He managed just to dig his claw into the neck of one, biting him, but it wasn't letting go. The other head let go of his shoulder, and rose up above him, and its neck and eyes began flashing and glowing. Try as he might, Godzilla couldn't free himself. Ghidorah's opened its mouth wide with a roar and leaned back, preparing its blast. And blast it did. The lightning blast struck Godzilla directly between the eyes and the point-blank range, resulting in the highest pitched shriek Godzilla had ever released. Ghidorah continued to release that blast into the face of the helpless king until Mothra finally arrived. She spilled her silk at the head and managed to force its mouth shut as it covered its eye. The other head let go of Godzilla just long enough to blast Mothra in the back between the wings before looking back at Godzilla, clamping down onto his throat once again. Mothra hit a building and fell to the ground, stumbling to get up with her one leg missing. Ghidorah's head she wrapped, using its lightning blast to melt away her silk and free itself, snapping its jaw at her with a snarl before looking back at Godzilla, who was quickly going limp and beginning to slump to the ground. The the head biting his throat let go as Godzilla hit the ground and proceeded to be enveloped by a blue burst stream as Godzilla suddenly unleashed his thermonuclear breath point blank, throwing the head backward and making it hit its body in the back. Ghidorah staggered back, its other head trying to blast him as he stood up, but Godzilla powered through and released another massive burst stream into Ghidorah's chest, forcing him backwards. Ghidorah's claw dug into the ground to try and slow his slide, but it didn't do much good. Godzilla stopped the burst stream just in time for Mothra to take to the air again and sting Ghidorah in the mid-back before flying off as fast as she could. But as she could gain some distance, an orange glow behind her made her turn in the mid-air as Rodan slammed his talons into the center of her abdomen and smashed her into a building. Mothra shrieked in agonizing pain as green-yellow blood erupted from both her now half-crushed abdomen and her mouth into Rodan's chest as he breathed heavily with a snarl of deadly intent etched into his face. Rodan reared back and jammed his beak into Mothra's upper mid-thorax, resulting in another shriek of agony. Back on the Argo, Eileen stumbled and fell to the ground, clutching her heart with a loud gasp. "Eileen!" Serizawa exclaimed, rushing to her side. Everyone gathered around to help Eileen to her feet, as Serizawa helped her sit down. "Eileen, talk to me. What happened?" he asked. She could only gasp through ragged, deep breaths, as if she had just had the wind knocked from her lungs. "Oh God, Mothra," Graham said quietly. Everyone looked at the screen and saw the devastating predicament she was in. Talons embedded in her abdomen, half crushing it, and a beak in her upper mid-thorax. Green-yellow blood oozing from the wound and from the corners of her mouth as she released shriek after shriek, with Rodan holding his beak in place and trying to push through. "Please, help her," Helene begged through a gasp as she watched the screen. "Helene, don't worry. It'll be alright." Serizawa cooed, stroking her hair. "It will be alright. She's not alone," he said firmly as he glared at the screen. Rodan never saw it coming. He was ripped away from Mothra by Godzilla's mighty claws and slammed into the ground onto his back. Godzilla's right claw held his shoulder, while his left claw pushed against Rodan's stomach. Godzilla's eyes and spines flashed, and he unleashed a powerful burst stream directly beside Rodan's head. The burst stream ended, and Rodan and Godzilla huffed a forceful snarl through his nose as Rodan trembled in fear beneath him. Godzilla pushed Rodan into the ground a bit further and stood up, snarling and growling as he continued flashing his spine. Rodan slowly relaxed against the ground and turned his head away to the side. What's he doing? Rick asked. He's submitting, Serizawa said. So Godzilla just beat him? Sam asked. No, but he showed Rodan he is capable of killing him, but won't, Serizawa stated proudly. Thank you, Eileen whispered as she looked at another screen. Mothra had fallen to the ground off the building she had been pinned to. Blood poured around her body as her eyes fluttered half shut. Her abdomen was still crushed, and she was struggling to breathe properly. Godzilla approached her cautiously, leaning down as he released a soft growl. Mothra chirped weakly and followed it. Her head hit the ground. And following it, her head hit the ground. She was still breathing, but only just. She can't fight anymore. Eileen sobbed, sniffing back against her tears. The roars of Ghidorah echoed through the air, and Godzilla snarled viciously as he slowly turned towards his alien nemesis. Chapter 21 The Cry of the Goddess. Screeching to a halt, Emma's jeep pulled up in front of the pile of rubble where the Russell family home used to be. Mark threw open the door, causing it to snap from the hinge and hang loosely as he leaped out of from the vehicle and sprinted towards the room. Maddie! He shrieked. Mark slipped in a slick mud patch, slamming his arm into the ground and feeling a pop and a zing of pain in his through his mid back. Groaning and grimacing, he forced himself to his feet as Emma rushed to his side to help him up while the soldier checked this area. Help, look! I'm fine, he ordered. Emma dashed into the ruins, shouting for Maddie as Mark laid on his back in the mud, rain pelting his face as he gripped his injured shoulder. As he listened to the soldiers and Emma shout, Maddie, where are you? Emma cried. Suddenly, a flash of light brought Mark back to the cabin in the woods. He was standing on the front steps, looking out at the lake beyond the trees. He heard laughter to his right, and when he looked, he saw himself chasing a young Andrew and Maddie around and around the largest tree in the forest, which happened to be just a stone throw away from the cabin. Maddie, where are you? He heard Emma shout from behind him. Mark turned around to see Emma emerge from the door and walk past him as if he wasn't there. Hey, Maddie, come here. I need to talk to you, she called with a wave and a smile. Mark looked out towards himself and the tree, and the kids, and saw himself shoo Maddie away to talk to Emma while he continued to chase Andrew around the tree. Another flash, and he was inside the living room, and he instantly remembered what it was about. Maddie, tell the truth, sweetheart, he watched himself say to her as she sat on his lap, with a semi-angry and guilty face. Maddie, it's okay, baby. Just tell me the truth. Did you break the chime? Emma asked softly. Maddie fervently shook her head and buried it in Mark's chest, gripping his shirt tightly. Mark smiled and gently rubbed her back. It's okay if you did, sweetie. We're not mad at you, he cooed. I didn't do it, she cried. Andrew, sitting next to Emma's hip, rubbed his hands together and looked down and away while Emma rubbed his shoulder. Andrew? Mark asked. He didn't make eye contact. Emma smiled and pat his back. Andy, did you accidentally break the chime? She asked. He let out a frustrated breath. Hey, don't worry about it, big guy. It's just a chime. We can get a new one, Mark assured. Andrew shook his head. I didn't break it, he said. Mark and Emma looked to each other, not knowing which child to believe. So, Maddie didn't break it, and you didn't break it. Do you know who did? Mark asked calmly, still rubbing Maddie's back as she peeked out of the corner of her eyes to look at Andrew. Yeah, it was a bird, Andrew said. A bird? Emma asked. He nodded. It was pecking at Maddie, so I threw a rock at it. It flew away and smashed into the chime and knocked it down, Andrew replied. Emma and Mark seemed to share a moment of understanding as they looked at each other with a "oh" kind of face, mouth slightly agape, before nodding to one another. I guess that explains the feathers next to the swing then, Mark said. Andrew nodded, still not making eye contact. It's okay, Maddie. It's okay, Andy, Emma said, giving him a hug and a kiss. I'm sure that neither of you nor the bird meant to do that, right? She asked. He shook his head. Well, hey, that gives us an excuse to buy an even bigger chime, Mark stated happily as he picked Maddie up and held her aloft, much to her growing delight. Yeah, what do you think, Andrew? Want to help us shop for a better chime tomorrow? Emma asked, giving him a reassured side hug. Andrew chuckled and nodded, while Maddie cheered at being held up by her father. And as Mark himself watched the scene and conversation unfold, he looked at Andrew and noticed for the first time his discomfort. Now, he understood why the discomfort was there. Andrew said he had thrown a rock at the bird, and it flew off towards the chime. There were feathers by the swing set, meaning he didn't just throw the rocket bird at the bird, he got a direct hit. Mark had spotted a dead bird not far from the cabin the next morning as they were driving away, but back then he hadn't registered what it meant. He thought it was a simple case of predation or poor health, which took its life, but now he understood after remembering Andrew's face. Andrew killed the bird by accident while trying to protect Maddie. A flash of golden lightning snapped Mark back to reality. He grimaced as he forced himself to stand and plodded through the mud towards the wreckage of the home as he and the others searched for Maddie. Mark pushed over every slate of wall and flooring he could, aided by Barnes and one other soldier, while the rest combed the area with Emma to see if Maddie hadn't gotten away from the house. Madison! Mark shouted. Sir, over here! Martine called. Mark saw what looked like a hand hanging over the edge of the bathtub, which had previously been on the second floor, and a massive slab of roofing partially covering it. Mark sprinted over as best as he could and helped the team lift the roofing, while Barnes called Emma and the others over for backup. Together, they all managed to lift and throw the roof to the side, revealing Madison's body inside her tub, her eyes closed and her chest still and stern. Mark, despite his wounded arm, lifted Maddie carefully out of the tub. Maddie, he yelled, sitting down and cradling her across his lap as he held her head. Madison! Emma shrieked as she slid to a stop and knelt beside Mark, grabbing Maddie's hand and holding it tightly in her own. Maddie wasn't breathing. Maddie! Mark shouted, trying to shake her awake. Maddie, baby, can you hear me? Emma cried, kissing Maddie's hand. Get the defibrillator! Barnes shouted. It was in the chopper when it was destroyed, sir, Martinez replied. Damn it, Barnes exclaimed. Mark continued trying to shake Maddie awake to no avail. Maddie, oh God, Maddie, wake up, baby, please, he begged, holding her head against the side of his face and gently rocking forward and back. Please, baby girl, please wake up. Daddy's here. Wake up, he pleaded. Emma wept bitterly beside Mark, still holding Maddie's hand as the soldiers all stood back and backed off to give the pair space. Please, not again. Please, God, not again. Don't take my baby girl away from me, please, Mark begged. Suddenly, a slab of debris fell to the ground, just 50 meters away. The soldiers all brought weapons up to see what it was, and the entire group was shocked to see Mothra crawling across the ground. Hold fire! Barnes shouted, lowering his weapon while the others did the same. Emma looked to Mothra, shaking Mark and trying to get him to look at her, but Mark wouldn't stop cradling and rocking with Maddie. Mothra let out a slow, soft, pained whimper of a cry as she looked out at the humans gathered before her, while a roar from Godzilla in the background briefly diverted her attention. As the roar died away and a flash of blue light lit the skies, Mothra looked back towards the human as they all stared up in wonder as she got just a little bit closer. Mark! Emma shouted, shaking him violently. What? He cried. Emma turned his head to see Mothra, who was staring directly at him. Mark then remembered Ilian telling him myth is our compass. He wasn't much for the myths, but he did know that some deities were capable of interfering with the process of death. It wasn't much, but it was the only hope he had left. Mark stood up, carrying Maddie in his arm as he approached Mothra, while giant blue eyes tracked him every step of the way. Pausing before her, Mark held Maddie close to his chest and fell to his knee. Please, he said quietly. I don't know if you can understand me, or if you even care, but please, if there's anything you can do for my baby girl, I beg you to do it, he whimpered, tears rolling down his cheek. Mothra let out a small wobble and looked up, slightly more towards Emma. Emma remained silent, but as Mark observed her head tilt ever so slightly, he realized she was remembering something. Mothra looked back to Madison in Mark's arm and leaned forward gently. The closer she got, the faster Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Mothra was so close. If Mark just reached out a hand, he could touch her. Emma walked up beside him and took Maddie's hand and held it out as Mothra inched closer. Connection. Maddie's hand lay flat against Mothra's lower jaws as Emma held it out, and Mothra again let out a soft wobble. The sound of the rain began to fade. The pounding of his heart, now the only thing filling his ears, as he looked at Maddie's face. Mark leaned down and kissed her cheek. Come on, baby girl, Emma urged quietly. As Emma's voice seemed to be reverberating through the area, Mark slowly heard music begin to fill the void left by the rain. It was the same music as he heard before, and she appeared in the skies above Castle Bravo while glowing like a sun. A soft, soothing melody filled the air, and Mothra's wings began to shine as the glowing specks of energy seemed to rise out of them. Mothra looked down at Maddie and chirped, and after receiving no response, the music grew louder and her wings grew brighter as she lifted her head skyward and let out a much more powerful shriek. An instant later, Maddie's eyes shot open as she took in a huge gasp of air before coughing a fit, while the sounds of the world flooded back into their ears like a tsunami. Mark and Emma instantly collapsed to the ground, hugging Madison as tightly as possible while she coughed up a small amount of water and hugged them back. The soldiers all looked back at the family and then to Martha, who lowered her head and seemed to be panting from exhaustion. What the hell? Asked one soldier. Never underestimate a Titan, man, Barnes said, shaking his head with a smile. But before the group could celebrate further, a high-pitched shriek from Godzilla caught their ears, and slowly they all turned around to look towards the ongoing battle between the Alpha and the False King. Chapter 22. Power Beyond This World. A single stomp shattered the asphalt in the street and crushed the concrete sidewalks underfoot as Godzilla stumbled backwards, following a massive surprise tail whip from Ghidorah. His arm shot out to the side to try and break his fall, but his massive claw shredded the building and he tumbled to the ground onto his side. Ghidorah stood tall and spread his wings with a mighty roar as all three heads snarled and hissed at Godzilla, who was slowly pushing himself to his feet. Be it arrogance or confidence was anyone's guess, but Ghidorah remained stationary and gave Godzilla all the time he needed to catch his breath, turned around to continue the fight. Godzilla took a deep breath and let fire with his thermonuclear breath, but Ghidorah simply lurched its center head out of the way as Godzilla closed his mouth. The three head hissed and cackled at Godzilla, taunting him as the two tails shook behind them like rattlesnake tails with all spikes extended out. Godzilla snarled and roared in anger, his spines flashing brightly as he began a charge towards Ghidorah. The false king stood his ground, and as Godzilla reached him, all three heads lunged forward and slammed the tops of their heads into Godzilla's chest. The impact caused a shockwave, and Godzilla stumbled back, letting out a gasped breath, as if coughing. Ghidorah cackled again, flapping his wings at his opponent and blowing all the rain that fell before him onto Godzilla. The alpha predator took a few steps back and shielded his face from the winds, producing by Ghidorah's wing, and roared angrily as the flapping came to a stop. Godzilla threw his arm to the side and snarled as Ghidorah continued cackling at him. Godzilla's spine flashed violently as did his eyes, but Ghidorah was not impressed. But then Godzilla let out a roar, which produced a shock wave that struck Ghidorah's body. It didn't damage him, but it made the cackling stop as all three heads looked at one another, wondering what he just done. Another 2 seconds later, a screech came from above as Rodan pierced the cloud layer with a burgundy bullet, like a burgundy bullet, and slammed his talon into Ghidorah's back just below the wing. Ghidorah screamed in agony as Rodan burrowed his beak into the flesh just below the point where the neck connected to the torso, producing a spurt of brown-red blood. Godzilla charged his thermonuclear breath and let fly into Ghidorah's chest, which caused the creature to roar out again in pain. The two outer heads turned around and blasted Rodan with a lightning, forcing him off his back, while the middle head blasted Godzilla in return for the thermonuclear blast. The lightning struck Godzilla's stomach, and had he not been gashed, it would have been easier enough to deal with it. But with the gashes still present, the lightning seared his softer flesh beneath his rugged hide and forced him to turn away to protect himself. Rodan flew up and back, circling overhead like a vulture, waiting to dive on a carcass as Ghidorah's outer two heads tracked his every movement and mouth agape with a glowing flashing along the throat. Rodan began to dive, and as the two let fly at him, he flapped one of his wings and rolled to the side to avoid the blast before slamming his talons into Ghidorah's right wing as they brought it up to defend themselves. The talon tore the thinner layers of flesh, producing 4 long claw marks through the slam as they ripped downwards before Rodan was grabbed by the center and right head and blasted in the side of the head by the left. The two left, holding him, whipped him around in circles before letting go and throwing him into a building, which collapsed and buried him under the hundreds of tons of rubble. A flash of blue light to the side made the heads turn, and they were all met by a direct hit from Godzilla's thermonuclear breath and thrown backwards The breath came to an end, and Godzilla snarled with a huff through his nose, producing a puff of steam. However, the three heads slowly came up to full height, slightly singed, but began cackling again as Godzilla's eyes widened slightly. Whoa, what happened? They shouldn't knock them off their feet. That should have knocked them off their feet, right? Sam asked. It's his breath. It's losing its potency, Dr. Graham called. No kidding. Godzilla's radiation levels are still critical, but a secondary scan showed his tanks running on empty, Rick shouted, displaying the readings on the screen. Wait, isn't his radiation level how he charges the breath? Sam asked. Not entirely, Dr. Graham stated. Godzilla's body uses radiation as a fuel source, yes, but his body also has its limits. He can only process so much radiation at once before his body runs dry. The radiation we're seeing that indicates an explosion is the radiation that's running unchecked throughout his body and not actually being used for his other natural processes, she continued. It's a bad plumbing leak, basically. All the radiation we're seeing is the water that escaped. The piping, well, a little bit managed to keep flowing before it runs dry. And once that happened, all we're left is the water damage effluent. But in this case, the water is a volatile nuclear waste that is primed to blow, Rick added. Oh, great, Sam stated as he looked at the street. All ships, give Godzilla some cover. Get off that freak's head's attention, Foster called. Copy that, a pilot replied. All remaining squadrons immediately formed up and circled around as they began strafing run of attacks against Ghidorah. The explosion of the missiles barely did more than irritate them, but Godzilla let them continue as Godzilla stomped towards him, ready to continue. Damn, that lizard's tough! I love it! Rick shouted. Godzilla and Ghidorah collided as missiles waved in and out of the space between them and struck Ghidorah's body, while Godzilla continued swiping with claws and aiming to bite the neck whenever they came close enough. The distractions from the planes and Godzilla's onslaught were starting to drive him back, but as Godzilla pinned two heads to a building, the third looked to a nearby power plant as it sparked and cracked in the rain before biting it. Godzilla looked down, too late to stop it, and Ghidorah's body began letting out off stray sparks of lightning, which struck Godzilla and forced him to take a couple of steps back. A few bolts connected from Ghidorah to the clouds, and he threw his wings open. He unleashed a mighty burst of electrical energy into the sky. All the fighters within a certain range were instantly wiped out, while Godzilla was seared all across his body with the supercharged attack. He staggered back, slamming his claw into a building for stability as a freshly opened gash across his left brow and cheeks just barely misses his eyeball. Now it sizzled and lets off steam in the cold rain. Damn it! All remaining craft retreat, Foster called, not willing to risk another life. The planes all fled the field, including Argo, leaving Godzilla alone to face this menace as he took a deep, desperate breaths to a bed to recover. Rodan has since recovered and he arrived once again to help, but Ghidorah's counterattack left Rodan incapacitated as a building was demolished by Ghidorah's tails as the base, causing it all to fall directly onto Rodan's head. His wings went still up against the ground, but the subtle rise and fall of his chest indicated life. Ghidorah returned full attention to Godzilla, who was still struggling to breathe, and all three heads began cackling and shaking themselves at him. Godzilla snarled, trying to get out one last breath out. The flashing in his spines had died away, and had become a little more than a weak flickering. Oh no, Serizawa stated quietly. He's out of power, Dr. Graham whispered. His tank's empty, but the leakage is beyond critical. We got 3 minutes, Rick shouted as a warning sign appeared on all monitors. Ghidorah roaring. At the weakened Godzilla leaped high into the air and slammed its feet into his face and stomach. The one on his face wrapped its claws around his head, clamping his mouth shut as the claws on the other foot dug into Godzilla's hide, while the tails wrapped around his lower midsection. With a mighty single flap which produced a sonic boom, Ghidorah lifted Godzilla into the air and began to ascend. Higher and higher into the skies, Ghidorah flew with Godzilla, while one hand had since come down to wrap his round his neck and choke him out until he lost the strength to struggle. Reaching the peak of his ascent, Ghidorah's free head looked down at Godzilla. The alpha predator slowly opened his eyes and snarled, leading to a sinister hiss, as both feet and tail suddenly let go. The world went quiet to Godzilla as he began a rapid and uncontrolled descent towards the earth below. Reaching the terminal velocity, his body ignited with flames produced by the enormous friction generated by his massive bulk, colliding with the atmosphere and all elements present within. Down, down, the fiery form of Godzilla fell like a giant meteorite, with all down below, watching in horror and with bated breath as the mighty titan struck the earth, producing a massive concussive shockwave that shattered buildings within several hundred meters of his impact zone. The burst also blew back the rain for several seconds, giving the world a few seconds respite before it all came falling back down. A subtle electric glitch sizzled through the Argus feed before it corrected itself. "Oh, God," Dr. Graham whispered. "Gojira," Cyril whispered in awe. Everyone on board the Argo held their breath as the smoke cleared, revealing Godzilla lying still in a massive crater. Rodan had awoken, freed himself from the rubble, but was too weak to rejoin the fight as he limped to a safe place on the edge of the battlefield and slumped to the ground on his stomach. Ghidorah, meanwhile, landed at the edge of the crater, looking down at the once proud alpha predator, as his eyes fluttered halfway open, accompanied by the weak sounds of breathing and subtle puffs of steam from his nose. "He's still alive," Sam said quietly. "Barely," Rick replied half-heartedly. Ghidorah's free head cackled loudly as he flared his wings as if declaring his victory. Chapter 23: Desperation. The collective mood had darkened considerably, with Godzilla lying in a heap at the center of a deep crater, Ghidorah cackling down at him from the upper edge, Martha on her last legs, and Rodan having retreated to the edge of the battlefield to recuperate. The future of this battle now seemed a foregone conclusion. "Anyone got any idea?" Barnes asked. "Nah, man," a soldier replied. "Mark, maybe we could do something," Emma said, tugging his arm. "And what exactly can we do against that thing?" he asked. Emma rolled her eyes. "If we can get the orca working again, we can at least distract it for a few minutes and give Godzilla some time to get back in the fight," she replied. "Wait, you want me to get that thing's attention? What about Maddie?" Mark retorted. "Dad, don't treat me like a helpless kid." "But, Mark, listen, we need Godzilla back on his feet. It's our best chance to survive this thing." "Oh, sure, let's just get Ghidorah's attention and have him come eat us as a distraction." "Will you stop it?" "Stop what, Emma?" "Stop acting like I haven't thought this problem through. You think I want my daughter to be put in danger? You didn't seem to have any problems with it until now." Emma's jaw dropped, as did Maddie's. Barnes was about to break them up with when a gunshot resounded and caused a soldier to drop to the ground. Maddie screamed as her mother shielded her eyes, and Mark stepped in front of both of them on instinct as Jonah and his minions encircled the group with weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons, gentlemen," Jonah said calmly to Barnes and the others. "You first, big man," Barnes retorted. Jonah shook his head. "That's not how this works. We got more men and more guns. We give the orders. Now drop your weapon. Jonah's man all took a half step forward and placed their finger over the trigger. Barn and his men glanced to one another and slowly put their weapons down. Once they were disarmed, Jonah waved his hands, and his men retrieved the dropped weapons and herded Barnes and the others to the side in their line, while Jonah approached the Russell family. "Welcome to hell, everyone," he announced, gesturing to Ghidorah, who was now taking flight and circling above Godzilla, still cackling, still taunting. "Monster Zero is going to wipe out Godzilla and his two followers from this Earth, and then is going to set his sight on us, humanity, the disease that has this beautiful planet in a strange hold. And once he's done, he'll... Why don't you shut up already?" Mark interrupted. Jonah cocked his head to the side slightly. "You're the one who kidnapped my little girl. Why don't you come a little closer? Settle this like a man, instead of a coward with an armed posse." "Huh?" Mark, "what are you doing?" Emma whispered. Matty gripped his jacket while Jonah chuckled. "You seem to be under the impression I have something to prove. Hmm, I'll pass on your challenge. There's something I want you to bear witness to instead." Jonah pulled out his pistol and took aim at Emma, shooting her in the shoulder, causing her to drop the damaged orca. Matty instantly rushed to her side in a panic, with Mark barely being able to contain himself as he glared daggers at Jonah, who stood quietly, smirking at him. "The next one will find your daughter's brain stem if you don't cooperate, Mr. Russell. Do we understand each other?" Mark growled angrily through gritted teeth as his fist shook at his side. "Good. Now then, if you please, the orca." "It's broken," Mark retorted. "It doesn't matter. I just want it out of your hands. Now give it to us." Another lackey with a gun came up beside Jonah with a hand extender. Mark knelt down slowly and picked up the device, holding it just to the side and out of arm's reach of the lackey. "Mr. Russell, don't make me repeat myself again," Jonah said, cocking the trigger of the pistol and aiming it directly at Maddie. All right. Mark slowly handed the orca to Jonas Lucky, put it into a metallic box, which was then sealed shut and loaded onto a van. Half of Jonas' men entered the vehicle and another vehicle, while the rest remained with weapons trained on Barnes and the other soldiers. "Much obliged, Mr. Russell." Jonah put his pistol away and smirked at Manny, who was glaring daggers at him, while her mother gasped for air while putting pressure on her wound. But it was Jonah's smirk at Maddie which caught Emma's attention. "Jonah?" she said quite calmly. Jonah looked at her with a smile and lifted his chin. "Yes, doctor? Do you have a family?" "I don't think that's important." "I think it is." "Well, you thought wrong. Good day," he said as he turned his back to her. "You have a daughter, don't you?" He started walking. "Or is she dead?" He paused just short of the van and glanced slowly over his shoulder, and Emma returned his smirk smile. "So that's it. I knew that there had to be something bigger motivating you this whole time. Nobody becomes a radical like you without something having pushed them to the extreme." He half turned, his lip tightening and a subtle scrunch in his nose. "Mom, are you trying to get shot again?" Maddie whispered. "Obviously, she died because of a human being. But how did she die, Jonah?" He bared his teeth as he spoke. "I think we're done here, Doctor. You should focus on living," he growled as he hopped into the van and hit the dividing window to make the driver take off. The rest of these men scattered in their vehicles and also drove away, leaving the Russell family and the soldiers wondering what to do. "So what was the plan? What was that plan?" Barnes asked. "Not exactly," But it was the start, Emma said. A start to what? Exactly, Mark asked. Taming a monster, she replied as the combat medic came to attend her wound. What do we do now, Dad? I don't know, sweetie, but we can't stay here. We're too close to the fight and lightning struck the remain of a skyscraper just up the road, catching everyone's attention. Jesus, Barnes shouted. Come on, get her in the jeep and let's go, shouted another soldier. Barnes helped the medic load her into the jeep, while Mark hopped into the driver's seat, with Maddie's sitting next to him. Out the window, Ghidorah seemed to be done gloating as he began a descent towards the crater. Dad, isn't there anything we could do to help Godzilla and the others? Can't you contact Monarch? I wish I could, sweetie, but they have their own personal communication system in place. Special phones and radio frequencies and all that. I don't know the details, but I know it's what they do. Damn it, Maddie huffed. A rumbling in the ground signaled Ghidorah's landing in the distance. Maddie turned around and looked at Barnes. I can contact them, Barnes said, grabbing his radio. Monarch, this is Sergeant Barnes. Come in. Static. Monarch, this is Sergeant Barnes. Come in. Repeat. Come in, anyone, he asked forcefully. The radio flickered to life. Hello? Oh, where? Monarch, this is Sergeant Barnes. Do you read? Over. Barnes and our me. You're garbled. Repeat. I say again. Repeat. Barnes. Can you hear me? Colonel Foster, I read you. Where are you? Uh, he lowered the radio. Hey guys, where are we? Eastbound, heading for the highway. Can you send someone to pick us up? Mark asked. Eastbound, heading for the highway. We'll set off a flare for you, Barnes relayed. Negative. No flash. It'll get that thing's attention, Foster replied. Shit, he muttered. Do it anyway, Barnes. Distracting Monster Zero is the plan anyway, Emma said softly. You mean Ghidorah? And are you shoe docked? He asked. Yes, anything to keep him away from Godzilla for a few more minutes. We don't need Foster. How are we going to get away from him? Emma, Mark asked as calmly as he could manage. We might not need to, Mark. How do you figure that? Monster. Ghidorah is an apex predator. Right now, its target is Godzilla. If we distract it for a moment and it seems nothing but another vehicle driving away, it's bound to lose interest sooner than later. We present no threat to it. You really think that it's going to be that simple? You're the animal expert. You tell me. I wouldn't know where to begin with that thing, since Monarch doesn't have any significant data I have easy access to. Aline's files had some promise, but I still. Aline, Emma asked. Dr. Aline Chan, Mark corrected. Anyways, her family's personal files were promising, but I still couldn't learn much about Ghidorah other than what the myths and legends said about him, which wasn't much. What did you find, Dad? Only that it's a rival to Godzilla, and it's an alien. Wait, an alien? Emma asked. Oh yeah, I guess you and Jonah never knew that about him. When we were able to determine that he's not from this world, after finding some encrypted files on him buried in Eileen's database. So that's why he can cause such a storm when he flies, Emma whispered. Yeah, and it's why Godzilla's exhausted his power, even though his body's been supercharged by the nuke we've used on him. You did what? Marty asked. Long story, hon. I'll tell you later. Right now, he said, screeching the jeep to a halt. We've made it to the highway. Barnes, contact Colonel Foster and tell her to look up for the flare. Copy that, Barnes replied. Mark grabbed the flare gun and waited outside for Barnes to give the signal. With a single thumbs up from Barnes, Mark launched the flare. Meanwhile, in the crater, Ghidorah was pummeling Godzilla with both of his tails. Each hit knocked some wind from the Alpha's lung, and the blood trickling down his side from the spike-like protrusion on the tails, which was growing worryingly thick. But then, a small red light caught the attention of Ghidorah's right hand and hissed at the others, who both looked over at the light, and the monster proceeded to abandon its beatdown of Godzilla to investigate the source of the anomaly. "He's coming!" Mark cried as he saw the head appear over the edge of the crater. He leaped into his jeep and floored it, sending it rocketing down the highway as Ghidorah stopped to observe the light. He didn't even notice the jeep. A hiss and a single bolt of lightning from its mouth in the direction of flare seemed to satisfy Ghidorah's desire to kill the light as it vanished into the glow. And then, from behind, Ghidorah's free head all heard a familiar screech. Chapter 24. Bow to the King. From behind Godzilla's beaten and battered body flashed a weak light. Two long legs rose up above his arm before gently touching down and lifting Mothra up over his shoulder as he pulled himself up on top of him. Godzilla's eye fluttered open and slid to the corners of the socket as he turned his head to say. Mothra pushed her body up a bit higher and let out a screech, and Godzilla's head gently lies back down on the ground. Ghidorah then appeared over the edge of the crater, hissing and crackling down at the two wounded creatures beneath him. Mothra looked up at Mothra and screeched angrily, to which his central head responded by launching a single lightning blast next to Godzilla's head. Mothra's head snapped towards the bolt, watching Godzilla as he snarled pitifully, still trying to prove he was in the fight. Mothra slowly looked up at Ghidorah, who continued hissing and cackling at both of them. The center head suddenly nipped at the left, with some kind of argument seeming to break out between them. Mothra watched warily as the right head ignored the other two in favor of snarling down at her and charged his own lightning blast. Mothra's body quivered slightly as she anticipated taking the hit, and a sonic boom off to Mothra's left caught her attention, as well as the right head of Ghidorah. Rodan zoomed into view while slamming into Ghidorah at full speed, knocking the gigantic three-headed colossus off his feet and sending both of them skidding across the ground over 300 meters. Rodan hit a cluster of homes which slowed him down, and Ghidorah slid into the remains of what was left of the damaged skyscrapers, which fell on top of him and buried him beneath hundreds of tons of rubble. Mothra wobbled softly as she lowered her head and laid down on top of Godzilla with her wings spreading out over his body. Back on the Argo, everyone watched with dreaded expression. "Hey, what's she doing?" Rick asked. Elise was a river of tears, watching silently with hands clasped in front of her chest as she shut her eyes tightly. "She's dying," she whimpered. "Wait, what?" Rick asked. Serizawa dipped his head, eyes shut tight along with his lips, as he fought against the pain of seeing the mighty Mothra reduced to this. Dr. Graham put a hand on his shoulder to comfort him, while everyone else watched in silence. Ghidorah burst forth from beneath the rubble, throwing it for hundreds of meters in all directions as all three heads roared angrily. Light palmed through all three throats as they all unleashed their attacks everywhere, not caring where the attacks landed. What was left of all the buildings in his vicinities were completely leveled, and Rodan was also struck by the blast several times as they continued turning their heads on a continuous assault. With his body seared where the attacks trailed across his wings and torso, Rodan growled weakly. but did not rise. Ghidorah stopped his attack at last, and all three heads looked to one another with a deadly snarls as all three slowly looked directly at Rodan. The proud fire demon almost seemed to sneer at them as his cheeks rose slightly, pulling the corner of his beak upwards a bit, and Ghidorah's head did not take kindly to the expression. Ghidorah stomped over towards Rodan slowly, deliberately letting his thunderous footstep herald the fate which were coming for Rodan, who closed his eyes, still sporting that sneer. Stomp, 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 stomp. Ghidorah paused over Rodan, glaring down at him. Rodan's eye stayed closed, and the corner of his mouth was still turned up. Ghidorah roared down at him angrily, flaring his wings and slamming both tails into the ground behind himself. Rodan didn't respond. Ghidorah hissed loudly and blasted the ground next to Rodan's head in a similar fashion to how Godzilla had early in the fight. But again, Rodan refused to respond. He only continued to sneer with his eyes closed. Ghidorah had finally had enough of his insolence. The two outer heads grabbed Rodan's wing close to the shoulder and lifted him off the ground as the center head lunged forward and clamped down on Rodan's throat. The fire demon's eyes shot open as he choked and gagged against the vice grip around his airway. His leg attempted to slash out and slash with the talons, but Ghidorah held him far away that he couldn't reach. Mothra lifted her head as she heard the struggle unfold. She couldn't get up. She couldn't fly. All she could do was screech worriedly as Rodan's choke cries grew quieter, and the sounds of his thrashing began to fade. She looked down towards Godzilla, who was still lying down in a total exhaustion, with no signs of getting up anytime soon. However, a spark from Godzilla's spine caught her attention. She felt it against her abdomen and saw a faint blue glow beginning to rise within them. Warning alarms began blaring inside the Argo as Godzilla appeared on all monitors throughout the ship. Shit! We got 1 minute, Rick shouted. We gotta get out of here, Sam cried. Not yet. Did you find them? Foster demanded. Yes, ma'am. They're just ahead. We're preparing to touch down, shouted a crew member. Down on the highway, Mark and the others watched and waited for the Argo to descend low enough against the highway to extend its lower bay doors for them to board. Emma's shoulder had been patched up and her arm was still in a sling, with Maddie helping her stand. Dad, what do we do when we get aboard? Strap yourself in and keep an eye on your mother. Okay. Suddenly, a van raced up next to the group, and out stepped Jonah. The soldiers pointed their weapons at him, and Mark put himself between him and the others. What the hell do you want now? Mark shouted. I've come for the good doctor, Jonah replied. You think we're just gonna let her go with you? Mark retorted. You will, if you want her to stop Monster Zeros, he said. Wait, what? Mark asked. Look, do we really have time to argue about this? What do you think, Doctor? Emma walked up beside Mark and put a hand on his shoulder. Mark, it's all right. He's right. What? Mark yelled. Mark, there's no time. Get Maddie to safety. The Orca can do more than you know, and it's the only thing that will save Godzilla and the other Titans from Ghidorah. You... He began, but suddenly cut himself off as the Argo descended and opened its bay doors. Serizawa was waiting for them, urging them to quickly get on board. Goodbye, Mark. Take care of yourself, and watch Maddie for me, Emma said, cupping his cheek with her hand and giving him a light pat. Maddie tried to walk towards her, but Mark, Mark grabbed her carefully and held her back. Bye, Maddie. Be good for your father, okay? She said, doing the same for Maddie she had for Mark. Maddie was too shaken by the sudden decision to say anything. All she could do was shake her head no and cry as her father helped her board the Argo with the others. Once they were on board, the Argo rose into the air, with Serizawa giving Emma a solemn glance as the bay doors closed and the Argo flew away. Doctor. Yes. Let's go. Boarding the van with the orca in hand, she sat in the back and opened it. You fixed it? You don't we don't know how it works, but we know our way around the electronic equipment and splicing broken wires, Jonah replied. But what made you change your mind? She asked. Jonah was silent and looked ahead as Ghidorah appeared in the field of the van. It was a daughter, wasn't it? Emma asked quietly. Jonah slowly turned his head, lips tight. She wouldn't have wanted you to abandon everything for Ghidorah, would she? Emma asked. Jonah looked ahead in silence. Seems you're one more of us than you'd like to believe, she teased. One more word, and I'll throw you out the door, and you'll have to fend for yourself. Emma chuckled and fired up the orca, the display flickering to life as she searched for the function she needed. So, what do you have planned? Jonah asked. You don't know. Answer my question, Doctor. Funny that you'd come back to get me without knowing my plan. Last chance, Doctor. Fine, fine. The orca has one last function, but it's one that's going to get us killed. Pardon? You heard me. I have one specialized frequency in here that will drive Ghidorah absolutely insane, but it will also attract him. So, say no more. We'll drop you off somewhere out here so you can distract him as needed. Fair enough. You're just going to accept that? I've made a lot of mistakes, but this wouldn't be one of them. I've made peace with this decision. Very well, Doctor. I admire your courage. Thank you. This is close enough. The van stopped and Emma opened the door and stepped outside while settling the orchid down. Godspeed, Doctor. I don't know what happens to humanity in the end, but you're right that my daughter wouldn't want Monster Zero of all things to be the one to give this world back to nature. Emma nodded, and Jonah and the others sped away, while she sat down, let her finger hover over the activate button. Ghidorah had since thrown Rodan to the ground, stomping on his stomach and blasting his chest and neck point blank, causing obscene amounts of damage to his heart and shearing his left shoulder through to the bone. And with that done, he went back to the crater and looked down at the two wicked titans within. The three heads snarled and hissed, no longer content to taunt as they observed carefully. Mothra's wing covered Godzilla's body, and her head slowly lifted up towards Ghidorah as she let out a soft screech. Ghidorah's three head all began charging the lightning blast, and Mothra pulled herself a little further forward and over Godzilla as she lifted her wings and spread them more evenly over his body. Godzilla growled weakly, trying to use his left arm to lift Mothra off of him and to the side, but Mothra refused to be moved as she adjusted to his squirming and continued holding herself over him. Ghidorah let fly all three blasts, and the world fell silent. Back on the Arga, Eileen dropped to her hands and knees. No! She shrieked. Godzilla's anguished groaning was also filled the world in the absence of all other sounds, and the three bolts grew closer and closer, and the reflection of Mothra's determined eyes as she lowered her head down. As she did so, time seemed to stand still. Emma, Jonah, Mark, and Mark and Maddie, Sarisawa, Graham, Sam, Rick, Eileen, Foster, Barnes, everyone on board the Argo as it raced all away, all felt it. That soothing, beautiful tribal music filling the hearts and minds in the absence of time as Martha looked up and let out one final screech of defiance. Time regained its hold, and the blast slammed into Martha's body, causing a massive golden light to envelop her and the surrounding area, making it impossible to see what was happening. One final screech from the proud Queen of the Skies filled the air as an explosion erupted from and banished the light of Ghidorah's attack, and in place of Mafra was nothing but a floating aura which slowly sunk down and landed on Godzilla's, seemingly being absorbed into his body. And where it entered, a red light briefly flashed through the gap in his scaly hide. Ghidorah roared in triumph as the rest of the specters were left gasping and in tears. Godzilla groaned loudly, and Ghidorah immediately descended into the crater, heads almost slithering like snakes over the ground as he did so until he reached Godzilla and started biting him, and off, seemingly sucking the energy from his body. With each bite, the red lights within Godzilla entered Ghidorah's mouth and flashing along the throat down to the torso. Oh no, Rick said. What is it? Foster asked. The sensor seemed to malfunction or something. I can't get a read on Godzilla's radiation level anymore, Rick replied. What's that mean? Foster asked. I don't know, Rick replied forcefully. Whatever, just get us out of here, Foster yelled. The Argo fired up the afterburner and raced away as Ghidorah continued sucking the life out of Godzilla. However, after a moment, Ghidorah suddenly let go at his head, and his three heads shook violently, hissing and screeching as something almost seemed to be attacking him. Emma, sitting with the orca, had activated her special frequency and the label, The Gathering. The frequency in questions combined the frequencies of every Titan monarch knew of, creating a chaotic cacophony of noise which Ghidorah absolutely couldn't stand. The idea was that this would be the ultimate deterrent for the Titans. But in the case of Ghidorah, who was not actually a Titan, who if he wasn't from Earth, it would not it would likely not repel him as much as shake him up and aggravate him. And that seems to be the case. Ghidorah's head all grit their teeth against the noise as he took flight and tracked down the source of the sound with lightning and thunder cracking and flashing around him as he entered the air. Emma watched him warily, and one glance down from Ghidorah as Godzilla's red light began to illuminate the slope and the upper lip of the crater. Emma smiled slightly as she looked up to see Ghidorah land a couple hundred meters away while looking directly at her. She stood up from the orca, leaving it on and running, as Ghidorah snarled down at her, with eyes twitching and the spike on his tail shaking and rattling similar to a rattlesnake. I thought you were part of the natural order, but I was wrong. Ghidorah's front began flashing with a golden light as they rose higher into the air. If you won't protect this world, then you can leave it. Before you do, the three mouths opened as smaller sparks of electricity filled the air around his head. Bow to the king, Emma stated firmly. Ghidorah's free head let fly, enveloping the road around Emma with golden light as she vanished from view alongside with the orca and the sounds it was creating. On board the orca, Argo, Maddie broke down in Mark's arm, knowing full well what had just happened. Mark couldn't help but well as he struggled comforting Maddie and accepting Emma's choice. Even Jonah and his fan knew what this meant, and as the light of Ghidorah's attack faded, he pulled out an old photo of his daughter's smiling faces and stared quietly at it as the van officially left the city's limits. Ghidorah's head shook off the shock and irritation of the frequencies produced by the now silenced orca and glanced at each other as they sniffed at the air. What the hell? Rick asked softly as an unimaginable image came up on the screens. From behind Ghidorah, at the lip of the crater, as a wall of steam was rising up through the rainy skies. Ghidorah sniffed the air again and hissed loudly as the tip of Godzilla's head slowly appeared over the lip of the crater, swaying slowly from left to right with every step. Godzilla, body alight with a fiery crimson glow, marched up and out the crater with a powerful roar that split the skies with a shockwave. Ghidorah roared back at Godzilla and fled his wing, but the display had no effect on Godzilla, whose left foot reached the lip and pulled him up and out of the crater and onto level ground. Ghidorah got his first full look at Godzilla in this new state. Everything from his eyes, spines, the gaps of his scales were glowing with red light emanating from within his body, and the sheer heat radiating from him was melting entirely buildings as he walked by them. He didn't even have to touch them. Ghidorah charged his attack and let fly into Godzilla's upper chest, but the blast did nothing. Godzilla didn't so much as budge when he was struck, and he continued walking forward through the attack as Ghidorah continued pushing the attack. Godzilla drew closer and closer, and Ghidorah seized his attack long enough to charge forward and attempt to bite and suck his energy. However, Godzilla's reaction caught Ghidorah completely off guard. With speed Ghidorah didn't know he had, Godzilla grabbed the two outer heads, one in each hand. The heat from his body seared the flesh and scales clamped within their grasp, and he bit down the central neck as it came to bite him. His teeth sunk into Ghidorah's flesh, causing a brown red blood spurt, which evaporated almost instantly as soon as it was free from his body. Holding Ghidorah still, Godzilla's body began pulsing with the same sound of his thermonuclear breath. Ghidorah struggled mightily to get free, but it was no use. Godzilla held firm and did not move, until, at last, he released a mighty burst of superheated energy from his body, almost like a solar flare from the sun. Within the burst could be seen the wings of Mothra, accompanied by her signature shriek, and as it struck Ghidorah's body, Godzilla let go of him, and he staggered back from the heat from the attack, melted the flesh in his wings, and knocked him onto his back. Ghidorah rapidly struggled and kicked at the ground to back away from Godzilla as the heads launched another assault with the lightning blast. Godzilla's body once again began pulsing, and another burst of power, accompanied by the spirit of Mothra, erupted to sear the flesh away from Ghidorah's body. The two outer heads took the brunt of the attack, while shielding the center head, and the flesh melted away down to the bone, and then to nothing as the central head continued desperately trying to kick away at the ground to get distance from the now fiery king of the monsters. Godzilla would not allow an escape, however. He lifted one foot and stomped down onto Ghidorah's chest and unleashed one final massive burst of power, which overtook the world in a crimson light and blinded the world to what just happened within. The burst was so powerful it cleared the skies of all of Ghidorah's storm cloud for miles in every direction. On board the Argo, despite being outside minimal safe distances, they, all, they still all had to shut off the cameras and shield their eyes to avoid being blinded by the light. And slowly, silence returned to the world as the light faded and the slowly fading sunlight on the horizon shone for the first time, and in what seemed like an eternity. What happened? Rick asked. I don't know, but it looks like he finally exploded, Sam replied. Sarasawa tightened his lip, refusing to accept the idea that Godzilla had perished in that final assault. And as they turned the cameras back on to observe the carnage, the entire city of Boston seemed to have become a massive smoldering pile of ash after the attack. What few buildings were left partially standing were black and covered in burn marks, and everything within about the mile radius of Godzilla's position during the blast were practically glassed. Then the camera detected a tiny hint of movement. What was that? Barnes asked. Serizawa observed the movement and smiled. Gojira da, he stated firmly. The ground shuddered and burst upwards as the blackened head of Ghidorah rose up from the rubble. And for a brief instant many assumed the worst. But as the spines of Godzilla broke through the rubble, a wave of relief fell over the spectators. He rose out of the ruins, holding the severed head of Ghidorah in his mouth and slapping around the environment like a crocodile tenderizing its prey before beginning a drum roll. Godzilla's body began emitting that pulsing sound as the blue light flashed along his back and through his mouth, eyes, and even through the mouth and eyes of Ghidorah's still screeching head. That light shone brightly until Godzilla released his thermonuclear breath and vaporized what was left of his enemy. Godzilla's breath shot up into the skies and vanished into the void as he shut his mouth and let out a huff accompanied by a tiny spark of electricity and a puff of blue smoke. Jesus, good things is on outside, Rick stated firmly. For now, Elaine added, sensing a change in Godzilla. Maddie slowly looked up at Mark and buried her face in his chest. Mark responded by holding his daughter and stroking her hair. Eileen, noticing Mark's return, slowly walked over and stood beside him with a soft smile as he smiled back at her. She put a hand on his shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, and nodded slowly at her, and looked back at the monitors. So, what's next for you two? Eileen asked softly. Maddie turned her head and looked at Eileen, who gave her a smile. Maddie returned the smile a little bit and then snugged back against her father. We're going to have to find a new home for starters, Mark replied. I think I can help with that, Eileen said cheerfully. Mark chuckled, nodding subtly as he looked over at Sarasawa, who was smiling as well, and giving him a nod. Dr. Sarasawa, Sam asked. Sarasawa glanced to him. Now that Ghidorah's gone, what do we do now? Sarasawa took a deep breath as all eyes fell to him. Gojira has restored balance by killing the false king. Earth's Titan should resume their natural behavior now. What's the natural behavior exactly? Foster asked. This will they will search for territory to call their own, and it is likely they will enter human populated areas in the search. I doubt there will mean any harms in doing so, however. You know, the world leaders still wants to them destroyed, right? Foster cut him off. Yes, I'm aware, but we can't resort to force. Doing so will only cause further conflict, as it always does. It's time for the world leaders to learn that coexistence is a path, not an attempt at dominance. Good luck with that, Doctor, she said. She said as she sat in her chair. The Titan just wants to find a place to call home, much like us. If we can help them do so, we may inspire them to stick their own territory rather than wander into ours. But this is only a theory. We will have to wait to see what happens for now. Hey, check this out, Rick called, gathering everyone around his station. Looks like there were a bunch of Titans heading this way, but they're turning around and moving away now. What do you think happened? He asked. Ghidorah must have been calling for backup, but now he's dead. They no longer have a reason to come here. They're going they're going to return to their natural behavior now. This is a new world for them to explore now, after all. Huh, interesting, Rick said. Hey, look at that, Sam said, pointing to the main monitors. Rodan, still weak and wounded, was limping away slowly. Godzilla, however, stomped up beside him and stopped him with a loud growl. Rodan looked to the side towards the mighty Alpha and dipped his shoulder and head slightly, looking at him and clicking at him. Godzilla stared at him for a moment before huffing and turning away. Rodan clicked a few more times and then continued on his way. Looks like Rodan's had enough, Barnes said. Yeah, Godzilla too, Sam agreed. Gojira is going home, Serizawa stated. Godzilla suddenly stopped walking. Hey, what's he doing? Sam asked. Serizawa shook his head. Godzilla took in a deep breath and unleashed a powerful roar, accompanied by a large shockwave, and on all the monitors, all Titan movement came to a stop. On multiple monitors, live satellite feeds of the Titans around the world caught glimpses of them, all stopping and looking up towards the sky. Is he calling them? Sam asked. I don't know, man, Rick replied. I know what he's doing, Mark said at last, coming forward towards Serizawa. Now that he's killed Ghidorah, he's asserting his dominance to the other Titans, he concluded. So he's establishing that he's the new top dog, right? Rick asked. Basically, yeah, Mark replied. I thought she was already the alpha, Sam asked. He was an apex predator in the food chain, but he wasn't in a singular dominating presence to all the other titans. Some of those carvings and images from ancient times showed his kind had been in the past, but that's the past. This Godzilla had yet to establish himself in that position for more than Mothra and Rodan, as far as I could tell, Mark said. Oh, Sam whispered. Hey, look, Rick cried. On the monitors, the Titans all seemed to be dipping their heads and lowering themselves towards the ground in a submissive gesture. Oh, no doubt about it. He's the top dog, baby. The king of the monsters. All right, Rick cheered. Eileen rolled her eyes and chuckled, while the rest of the Argo seemed to also chuckle at the statement. Mark hugged Maddie a little closer and gave her an assuring shake as Eileen came over and put a hand on her shoulder as well. Maddie and Eileen introduced themselves, and Eileen gave her a big hug while offering condolences on the passing of her mother. Mark and Serizawa began a discussion about the future of the Titans, what they were likely to do, and where they were likely to go, and the others all began celebrating in their own ways. Meanwhile, Godzilla had finished his call and began a proud, confident march towards the sea, with the setting sun ahead illuminating his path as the sky slowly darkened overhead. The Alpha Titan, after a long, hard-won fight for his throne, was going home to rest.